Welcome to No Nonsense Nonprofits. Hi, I'm Sandy Ray, founder of Sandra E. Ray CPA, where we alleviate financial headaches so that you can create a bigger impact. Today, we're talking about volunteers versus employees and what are the legal and ethical guidelines that you should be following. Why does this distinction between volunteers and employees matter? It's not just a legal technicality. There is a distinction, and there's some consequences for misclassifying an employee as a volunteer. And specifically, that are the claims that person may have towards wages. And if that is imposed, then of course there's payroll tax penalties. And if severe enough, a loss of your not-for-profit status. But beyond compliance, it's about protecting your organization's integrity and the trust of your supporters, your volunteers, your donors, and the community. So I'd like to get started today by just explaining some of the key differences between volunteers and employees. Of course, the major one, employees are paid and volunteers are not. But volunteers, even more than payment, they're motivated by mission. They should have flexible hours, and their work should be supported by the employees that we have. Employees will have formal agreements, whether it's an employment contract, a job description, an employee manual, those kinds of formal agreements are in place. Employees will have set hours. You'll have performance expectations for employees, and employees will receive legal protections. So, is volunteering considered employment? And the short answer is no. The US Department of Labor and other agencies across the globe make it very clear that volunteering is not employment when it meets specific criteria. That criteria includes that the volunteer is giving their service freely and it's for charitable or humanitarian purposes. There is no expectation of pay now or for future employment. The role does not displace a paid employee. So you can't fire somebody and bring in a volunteer to do the job. The hours are flexible and self-directed. Now, you can have some say over when people are coming in to do volunteer work, but you can't, it's all up to the volunteer whether they're going to show up or not. And then the work is done for a nonprofit or public organization. There is no way that there can be a volunteer for a commercial enterprise. Let's talk about compensation and legal compliance. Basically, volunteers cannot receive compensation of any kind. But what is allowed? Because we want to do things for our volunteers to say thank you. We can bring in snacks. We can give them t-shirts. We can give them small appreciation gifts or recognition gifts. We can even reimburse them for mileage or parking or out-of-pocket expenditures that they make on our behalf. We can send thank you letters and certificates and recognize them on social media. What we're not allowed to do is give them gift cards or any cash or cash equivalent that could resemble wages. A regular stipend or a bonus is not allowable, and promises for work in the future, for paid work in the future, based upon volunteer performance, that is not allowed. Now, employees are covered by labor laws. They must receive minimum wage and overtime under the FLSA, Fair Labor Standards Act. And your state is going to have requirements regarding both minimum wage and overtime hours as well. You're going to want to comply with those for your employees. Your employees are also covered by workers' compensation, unemployment insurance, and anti-discrimination laws. And once someone receives compensation or benefits tied to their work, they're generally classified as an employee, regardless of what your organization calls them. So here's some things that I would like you to look for. I would like you to start looking at your volunteer classifications annually and conduct a review or an audit, ensuring that the roles are mission-based and unpaid. We want to make sure that volunteer duties never mirror employee functions, especially in a hybrid or project-based program. And we want to make sure that donors and funders understand how we are using volunteers, how we're classifying who's a volunteer or an employee. We can do that by reporting the number of active volunteers and the hours served, whether what roles are compensated. So providing this information promotes public trust in our organization. Just even, for example, even on the 990, we have to report estimated number of volunteer hours. So if we have tons and tons of volunteer hours and very few dollars in compensation, we may want to try to explain that on the 990 of what's going on and what these volunteers are doing and the wonderful support that they're providing to our organization. For best practices purposes, again, we want to talk about reviewing what a volunteer role is. We want to make sure that they're unpaid, mission-driven, and distinct from paid roles. So we want to probably document that. If we have an agreement of any kind with another entity that's bringing in volunteers for us, we want to have a description of what the role is and what the responsibilities are of the person conducting the role. We may need to do background checks on our volunteers. That's not unheard of, and in some situations it's required. We want to make sure that our volunteers understand that there's confidentiality about how our organization runs. Maybe if they come into contact with constituents, they're not supposed to name people, those kinds of things. You're going to want to have some emergency contact information from your volunteers. And then in this document, you're going to want to have clear language that this role is unpaid. So I think that's a really good thing, that maybe when you're doing some volunteer training, present all that, have them sign off that they understand all those things. Now that we've talked about the difference between a volunteer and an employee, what are the risks associated with misclassifying a volunteer as an employee? First of all, that person may have wage and hour claims for back pay. And then the organization could incur penalties for misclassification of an employee as a volunteer. And of course, once we get into back pay, then we're into payroll taxes that have to be paid. There's penalties and interest for underreported wages. And then we may have insurance gaps. The volunteer may be claiming that they should have had in benefits like health insurance during that time where they were considered a volunteer and not an employee. The legal ramifications are potentially wrongful termination or discrimination suits. If we've asked a volunteer not to come back and they come back with, yes, they were an employee, was there a wrongful termination there? These are legal issues that you're going to have to address with your attorney, but I just bring it up so that we can be aware of them. And then our nonprofit status risks. If we are systematically misclassifying employees as volunteers, there's a potential that we have a private benefit or inurement. And that is basically the nonprofit is directing resources or taking advantage of individuals or entities that does not serve the nonprofit's exempt purpose. Now, some of the things we can do to prevent this is we can conduct classification audits annually would be great. Keep signed agreements and clear records about who's coming and going. Avoid giving volunteers employee-like responsibilities. Many people have employees do data entry, have volunteers do data entry. Is that an employee responsibility? What are the rules that we're setting around that? Do they have to have, is there performance expectations? Are we setting their hours? Those kinds of things. We have to discuss that and make sure that this is really not an employee position. And then, of course, we need to train our team, our management staff, regarding the boundaries between a volunteer and employee and what to do to not cross those boundaries, and making sure that the team that's working with the volunteers is up to speed on all of these nuances of volunteerism. Our ethical considerations, beyond compliance, ethics plays a key role in our organization. How we treat our volunteers with respect and meaningful engagement reflects on our organization. We can recognize their contributions publicly and sincerely. And as many of us would not be able to do the work that we do without our volunteers. We want to make sure that our volunteers are treated with fairness in relation to themselves and to the paid staff. We want to avoid over-reliance on unpaid labor and still balance our mission and our enthusiasm for our mission. So to wrap up here, remember to review all your volunteer and staff roles. If you can do that this quarter, that would be amazing. Update your volunteer agreements and the descriptions of what those volunteers will be, of the duties those volunteers will be performing. Conduct a classification audit or legal review, and you may need to bring in an expert in this area. And then finally, educate your leadership team on these distinctions to make sure that we're following these policies and procedures that we've set forth. I hope this was helpful for you. And if you have any questions on this or other topics, please put that in the comment section below. We appreciate your likes, and I want to thank you for joining me today. Remember, creating a bigger impact starts with stopping the nonsense. If you're dealing with nonsense in your nonprofit organization, we'd love to help you cut through the noise.